So to create the main menu, I'm just going to right click and go to user interface, and once again I'm creating a widget blueprint. This is going to be called main menu, and it's going to be set up in a rather straightforward way. I'm going to have some text up top. I'm going to have a button that's going to be my main play button, and I'm going to have a high scores list beneath it. Don't really need to have anything else just yet. I'm going to anchor this. I'm going to anchor all of these to be 0 on the X with an alignment of 0.5. I'm going to put this with the same anchor so that it sits relative to it. But the anchor is going to be top left, so top middle. Zeroed out, 0.5. Going to make this quite a large piece of text. So this first piece of text that I add is just going to be the name of the game. Pinball game. You'll do. And I'm going to set this up to be large font. Again, we're going to customize this later and make sure everything looks good, but for the time being, this is really all we need. I've got this. Set its position to be there. Pinball game, the button itself, and now I'm just going to add some text to it. So I'm going to drag the text onto the top of the button, and you can now see that it's added the text here. So there's a couple of different ways I can approach this situation. Right now we're going to be using the button as the thing that we're clicking on, but I don't really want this button visible in the long run. That said, I'll fix that up later when we kind of do a aesthetic pass on this menu. For the time being, all I need to do is set up an on-clicked event so that when someone actually tells this to play, it'll do it. First up, I'm just going to quickly set this text box to say the word play. I'm also going to increase its size to just be a little bit more obvious. Great, and on this I'm going to go to onClicked. Now, this is saying onClicked for button 214. So again, we've done what we did earlier, whereby we hadn't actually named the button. So I'm going to rename this to play button with F2. And in my graph, you'll now see it says onClicked play button. So on play, well, what do we want to do? This is where we need to actually communicate with our game mode and have something actually set up. So within my game mode, I'm going to look at what we have at the moment, and I'm going to work out the best area for us to go from. Now at the moment on begin play, we call spawn ball, and then upon spawning the ball, we do what spawned ball should do. But we never actually have a start game or reset game function being called. So it's probably a good idea for us to set things up to go with that instead. So I'm going to create a custom event just called reset game that is now going to spawn the first ball. So I'm going to disconnect spawn ball from that and instead put it into reset game. And what we're going to do here is when reset game gets called, we're going to spawn the ball, we're going to set the score to 0. We're going to set the multiplier back to 1. We're going to set the balls remaining back to 3. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually do get class defaults and then hook these up so that they enter back in there. This way, if we ever change the defaults, these will reset themselves. High score name's never getting changed, so I can leave that. But otherwise, this is a simple function that we would have for reset game. That said, spawn ball should probably be called after I set everything else. Otherwise, we're going to try and spawn a ball that's not going to work. So I'm just going to move these across. So on reset game, we're going to be doing this. And as well as this, we're going to be spawning the player HUD when they reset. So I'm going to set this up to now call from the player controller. I'm going to just copy and paste these calls that we have from before. So I'm going to get the player controller. I'm going to cast it to a pinball player controller. At which point I'm going to create player HUD, which is the function that we created before. So when reset game gets called, this is what it's going to do. It's going to essentially start the game. So now I'm going to go to the function that we created earlier, which was create main menu. I'm going to make sure that its widget is correctly set to the main menu widget. And the final element is to go up to begin play, and when the game begins, create the main menu. I'm just going to make sure that everything else has been set up. In my high score entry, after we save the game to the slot, we now want to get the game mode, and we want to create main menu. Trying to neaten things up for us. So we've now got our save game set up correctly. In theory, our game mode is also set up correctly. And when I hit play, we're now going to see pinball game as our main menu. When I click play on this button, it's currently not going to do anything because we haven't hooked it up just yet, but we're nearly there. So if I go to my main menu, on clicked, I'm going to be getting the game mode. I'm going to cast to pinball game mode. And then from here, I'm going to call reset game. Compile, save. So when I hit play, it got rid of it. Now the first issue that it's gone ahead and done is when I hit play, my mouse is still on the screen. So I'm going to make sure that that gets disabled the next time we go around. But apart from that, everything should work fine. I'm going to quickly fix this mouse issue, which is simply the same call that we had before where we did show mouse cursor. I'm now going to make sure is correctly set when we call this on the player. So I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to plug the target into the player controller, and when we create the player HUD, I'm just going to disable the mouse cursor. So this is in my reset game function. Now the other issue that we haven't addressed yet is if I go to my main menu, into the designer, I have to go down here, and I'm just going to add that high score widget that we created earlier. I'm going to make sure that it's set up, centered from here. And from here, if I go into my pinball game mode, and I see where my main menu is initially created, which is up here, we call create main menu, which then goes down here. What we're not doing yet, that we have already done when we do the high scores list, is we haven't gone and called this get save game data function. So there's a few ways that we could do this, but the easiest way is for us to just call get save game data so that it gets correctly set. So if I was to drop this into here, compile, save, and then hit play, you'll see that all of my scores are listed here correctly now. And I can go ahead and I can play through the game. Just make sure I get a high score. There we go. And then it pops up again. Because I got a new score, I can now enter it. Person. And you'll see that that's now in there. So everything's correctly set up, and we now have a basic gameplay loop. So now it's time for us to actually start adding some more interesting score values and some far more interesting props within the world that we can use to create a more enjoyable game. However, before I do so, I'd like to change a couple of little details around here that are currently going to be causing a bit more overhead than I'd really like. I'm going to go to my high score widget and just change how this little bit is set up. Now, the reason I set it up this way was because I really wanted you to understand how bindings work and that we can output something in a nice, easy fashion, right? But the thing is that you've got to remember with bindings that literally every tick it's going to go through and it's going to reassess this to figure out what it should say. But the truth is that the high score widget only really needs to set its score when it's created and doesn't actually need to set its score at any other stage. So what I'm going to do is go to the getText function, and I'm going to rename this to just generates high score text is the new name of it. Now the reason I've done that is in my event graph for the high score widget, after event construct, which is kind of the equivalent of begin play for a widget, I'm going to drag in generate high score text, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit promote to variable, and this is just going to be called high score text. It's at this point that I'm going to go back to the designer for a moment, click on the high score, and where this says currently that this is bound to generate high score text, I'm just going to remove that binding, and instead I'm going to create a new binding that's going to be far simpler. So simple in fact that it looks like that. So what's going to happen now is when this widget is first created, it's going to figure out what it needs to say, and then from then on, it's just going to output that, and it's not going to keep running that loop every time. So you can see that when I hit play here, this is exactly as it should be. But this time, we're not adding all of this unnecessary overhead. Now, while it didn't matter too much here, because it was just a main menu, it is the kind of thing that can really matter when you're doing it with your actual game. So definitely keep it in mind that that's just a slightly nicer way to do some of these things. Just caching initially, and then working from there. So we have ourselves a basic win condition loop. When the game's over, it knows what to do if you've won and if you've got a high score. However, we are missing a little detail here, and that is what happens if you lose. So at the moment, if you fail to get a high score, this pin within end game never gets called. So it's a good idea for us to just add that in, otherwise you're going to have a very boring game once you lose. So to do that, all I need to do is call the function for either reset game to start the game again entirely, or create main menu. In my opinion, it's better for us to go back to the main menu and let them click play to start again. So off of false, I'm just going to drag, I'm going to type in create main menu, I'm now going to compile and save, and when I play the game and I lose, and there we have it. So when I failed to get a top score, I've gone back to this main menu, and everything is great. We have a complete loop that I can begin playing the game again straight away.